In late December 2025, something extraordinary happened in the Middle East that barely made headlines in the West, but sent shockwaves through the corridors of power from Riyadh to Abu Dhabi to Washington. Saudi Arabia, the birthplace of Islam and the Arab world's traditional powerhouse, launched airstrikes on weapons shipments belonging to forces backed by the United Arab Emirates. Let that sink in for a moment. Two countries that just 5 years ago were so closely aligned that analysts called them a single strategic entity were now literally bombing each other's proxies. The Saudi foreign minister rushed to Egypt. Diplomatic cables flew. Emergency meetings were convened. And across the region, a question hung in the air like desert dust after a sandstorm. How did we get here? The answer lies in a story that's rarely told in full, a tale of two visions for the Middle East that are now on a catastrophic collision course. It's the story of what happens when brothers take different paths, when strategic patience meets bold ambition, and when the promise of peace reveals its hidden price tag. This is the story of the Abrahamic divide. To understand what's happening today, we need to rewind to September 15th, 2020. The south lawn of the White House was bathed in late summer sunshine. President Donald Trump stood beaming as he presided over what he called a historic breakthrough. The United Arab Emirates and Bahrain were signing agreements to normalize relations with Israel, agreements that would come to be known as the Abraham Accords. The symbolism was powerful. The name itself, Abraham Accords, referenced the patriarch claimed by Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Here was the promise of peace, of commerce replacing conflict, of a new Middle East rising from the ashes of old hatreds. For the UAE, this was a calculated leap into the future. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed, known as MBZ, had been quietly building ties with Israel for years. The Emirates saw in Israel a partner for modernization, a counterweight to Iran, and a gateway to American security guarantees. Within months, direct flights began shuttling between Tel Aviv and Dubai. Israeli tourists flooded Emirati hotels. Tech companies set up joint ventures. By 2025, bilateral trade between Israel and the UAE would surpass $3.2 billion. Over 2 million Israelis visited the Emirates. Investment deals topped $5 billion. The UAE didn't just normalize relations, it went all in, embedding Israeli partnerships into its national vision. But there was one notable absence from the White House lawn that September day. Saudi Arabia, the kingdom that had long set the tone for Arab-Israeli relations, was watching from the sidelines. And in the years that followed, while everyone assumed Saudi normalization was just a matter of time, something unexpected happened. The gap between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi didn't close, it widened and widened, until it exploded into open confrontation. Here's what makes this so fascinating and so dangerous. The UAE and Saudi Arabia weren't just allies. They were the two engines of Gulf power, the twin pillars of regional stability. In 2017, they had stood shoulder to shoulder in blockading Qatar, convinced that Doha was supporting political Islamists who threatened their monarchies. They fought together in Yemen against the Houthi rebels. Their crown princes, Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed, were said to speak daily. They shared intelligence. They coordinated foreign policy. They were, in the words of one analyst, joined at the hip. So what changed? The simple answer is Israel. The complex answer is everything Israel represents about competing visions for the region's future. Let's start with Saudi Arabia's position because it's been remarkably consistent even as everything around it shifts. In public speech after public speech, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, known as MBS, has stated the kingdom's red line: no normalization with Israel without the establishment of a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. This position is firm and unwavering according to the Saudi Foreign Ministry. It's non-negotiable. When MBS met with President Trump in November 2025, he reiterated this stance in the Oval Office. We want to be part of the Abraham Accords, he said, but we need a clear path to a two-state solution. We want peace for Israelis and Palestinians to coexist peacefully. Now, here's where it gets interesting. According to a report in The Atlantic, during a private meeting with Secretary of State Antony Blinken in January 2024, MBS said something very different. He reportedly told Blinken, "Do I care personally about the Palestinian issue? I don't, but my people do, so I need to make sure this is meaningful." He even acknowledged the personal risk, pointing to Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, who was assassinated after making peace with Israel. "Half my advisors say that the deal is not worth the risk," MBS reportedly said. "I could end up getting killed because of this deal." This reveals something crucial. For Saudi Arabia, the Palestinian issue isn't just about principle, it's about survival. Polling during the Gaza war showed over 90% of Saudis believed Arab states should cut ties with Israel. The Saudi public, shaped by decades of pan-Arab solidarity and Islamic identity, sees Palestinian statehood as non-negotiable. For MBS, who has staked his legitimacy on transforming Saudi Arabia through Vision 2030, alienating his own population over normalization with Israel is a risk he simply cannot take. Not while Israeli military operations continue to devastate Gaza. Not while the West Bank sees accelerating settlement expansion. Not while the images of Palestinian suffering dominate Arab media every single day. But there's more to Saudi Arabia's position than domestic politics. Riyadh increasingly sees Israel not as a partner for stability, but as a source of regional chaos. In September 2025, Israel launched airstrikes on Hamas leaders inside Qatar, a move that stunned the Gulf states. Saudi Arabia condemned the attack and stood with Qatar with no limits, in the words of MBS. The message was clear. Israel was violating sovereignty, destabilizing the region, and acting with impunity. A former Saudi intelligence chief remarked that the kingdom would normalize when Israel began to act like a normal country. That day seems further away than ever. The UAE took a fundamentally different path, and that path has led to a fundamental break with Riyadh. When the Emirates signed the Abrahamic Accords, it did something unprecedented. It detached normalization from the Palestinian issue entirely. Previous Arab peace efforts, from Camp David to the Oslo Accords, had always centered on land for peace, on Israeli concessions in exchange for recognition. The Abraham Accords flipped that script. The UAE normalized first and hoped for Palestinian progress later. Many Palestinians saw it as betrayal. The Palestinian Authority condemned it. But the UAE pressed ahead, arguing the accords would prevent Israeli annexation of the West Bank. That promise quickly unraveled. Israeli settlement expansion continued. The government in Jerusalem, led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his far-right coalition partners, repeatedly rejected any possibility of a Palestinian state. One minister even visited the Al-Aqsa mosque compound in ways that violated long-standing status quo arrangements, sparking Arab condemnation. Yet, the UAE's relationship with Israel only deepened. Security cooperation agreements, intelligence sharing, joint military exercises, technology partnerships. The Emirates positioned Israel as a central pillar of its regional strategy. And this is where the story gets really complicated, because the UAE-Israel partnership isn't just about economics or even security. It's about a broader strategic vision that puts it at odds with Saudi Arabia across multiple theaters of conflict. Let's start with Yemen, where the current crisis erupted. Both Saudi Arabia and the UAE intervened in Yemen's civil war in 2015, ostensibly to fight the Iranian-backed Houthis. But their goals diverged. Saudi Arabia wanted Yemen to remain unified under a stable central government that could push back Iranian influence. The UAE had different priorities. It backed the Southern Transitional Council, a separatist group based in the port city of Aden, aiming to secure strategic ports and curb the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood. The STC even offered to normalize relations with Israel in exchange for support for Southern independence. In December 2025, this simmering tension exploded. Forces backed by the UAE seized oil-rich areas in Yemen controlled by Saudi-backed groups. The takeover appeared to happen with minimal resistance, raising questions about whether it had been carefully planned. Saudi Arabia responded with fury. It launched airstrikes on Emirati weapons shipments. It issued an ultimatum demanding the withdrawal of all UAE forces from Yemen within 24 hours. It dissolved the STC. The UAE announced a full withdrawal, but the damage was done. For the first time, these former brothers in arms were in open military confrontation. The implications reach far beyond Yemen. Reports indicate that Israeli intelligence has a presence on Yemen's Socotra Island, where the UAE maintains military facilities. The island sits at the mouth of the Red Sea, one of the world's most strategic waterways. Saudi Arabia sees this as encirclement, as a UAE-Israel axis establishing control over choke points that could threaten its own security and economic lifelines. Then there's Sudan, home to the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Saudi Arabia backs the Sudanese armed forces led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. The UAE supports the rival Rapid Support Forces militia commanded by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemedti. The RSF controls informal gold trade routes and has been accused by international observers of prolonging the civil war with UAE backing. This has infuriated Saudi Arabia, which has positioned itself alongside the United States as a supporter of mediation efforts. During MBS's November 2025 visit to Washington, he reportedly urged the Trump administration to pressure the UAE over its Sudan role. Saudi Arabia even coordinated with Egypt to restrict UAE use of their airspace for cargo flights suspected of supplying the RSF. Somalia presents another flashpoint. In late December 2025, Israel recognized Somaliland, a breakaway region, as an independent state. Somaliland pledged to join the Abraham Accords. Scores of Muslim and Arab countries condemned Israel's move. The UAE's name was conspicuously absent from that list. Why? Because the UAE has deep ties with Somaliland, including a strategic military base there. Saudi Arabia joined the condemnation. The kingdom sees Somaliland recognition as part of a broader pattern, a UAE-Israel-Ethiopia cooperation triangle that threatens Saudi interests in the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea. Ethiopia adds another layer. Ethiopia has been seeking Red Sea access through ports in Somaliland or Eritrea, triggering diplomatic tensions with Somalia and concerns in Cairo and Riyadh. Egypt and Sudan already have disputes with Ethiopia over Nile waters. Saudi Arabia is now rallying these countries, presenting them as resistance to what Riyadh frames as a UAE Israel-Ethiopia axis, trying to redraw regional borders and control strategic waterways. Saudi Foreign Minister Faisal bin Farhan visited Egypt to coordinate efforts, including pressuring Libyan military leader Khalifa Haftar to disrupt smuggling routes used to supply the RSF in Sudan. This isn't just about individual conflicts. It reflects fundamentally different strategic philosophies. Saudi Arabia prioritizes state sovereignty and established borders. It backs central governments and political coalitions that preserve the existing order. The UAE, according to analysts, mobilizes large proxy forces, backs paramilitary and secessionist groups, and appears comfortable reshaping political realities in fragile states. One Saudi defense analyst put it bluntly, while the UAE can mobilize large proxy forces, Saudi Arabia's advantage lies in international legitimacy, strategic depth, and economic leverage. The information war between these former allies has been brutal. After Saudi Arabia bombed UAE-linked forces in Yemen, Saudi social media exploded with attacks on the Emirates. Analysis of Saudi posts showed 77% attacking the UAE as Israel's proxy executing Zionist plans to divide Arab states. The UAE was labeled Israel's Trojan horse. The Abrahamic Accords were denounced as a political military alliance dressed in the garb of religion. A second analysis found influencers falsely linking UAE leaders to Jeffrey Epstein, claiming the UAE funded anti-Islam campaigns in Europe, and describing the country as an extension of Israeli policy. The UAE even lobbied pro-Israel groups in Washington to level anti-Semitism charges against Saudi Arabia, according to current and former U.S. officials who spoke to Middle East Eye. Groups like the Anti-Defamation League posted warnings about prominent Saudi voices using anti-Semitic dog whistles and pushing anti-Abraham Accords rhetoric. The UAE embassy didn't comment, but the intent was clear. Use every tool available to pressure Riyadh. Saudi Arabia's defense minister met with these same groups during a U.S. visit in what one former official called damage control. This is unprecedented. During the worst of the Qatar blockade crisis nearly a decade ago, Saudi Arabia and the UAE never publicly attacked each other like this. They stood together. Now they're in a full-spectrum confrontation playing out across social media, diplomatic channels, and actual battlefields. For the United States, this presents a nightmare scenario. The Trump administration has close ties to both MBS and MBZ. Trump sees Saudi Arabia as essential to his vision of regional peace through normalization agreements with Israel. He's offered the kingdom F-35 fighter jets, nuclear cooperation, and security guarantees. But he's also deeply invested in the Abraham Accords and the UAE's role in them. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and other officials are now caught between two headstrong regional powers who won't back down. Understanding the economic dimensions of this rivalry reveals why it's so intractable. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 is MBS's signature achievement and his path to legitimizing his rule. Unveiled in 2016, the plan requires transforming the kingdom from an oil-dependent economy into a diversified powerhouse. The goals are ambitious: reduce oil dependency, create millions of private sector jobs, attract foreign investment on an unprecedented scale, and position Saudi Arabia as a global hub for business, tourism, and technology. But there's a fundamental problem that becomes clearer every year. The UAE got there first. And not just first, but decades earlier. Dubai is already the region's financial hub, home to thousands of multinational corporations. Its stock market, banking sector, and free zones have been attracting global capital since the 1980s. Abu Dhabi is a global investment power with sovereign wealth funds managing hundreds of billions of dollars. Emirati Airlines, Emirates, and Etihad dominate regional air travel and connect the Gulf to every major market on Earth. The UAE's non-oil economy is thriving with tourism, real estate, technology, and services contributing over 70% of GDP. This diversification took decades to build. It's embedded in infrastructure, institutions, and international relationships that can't be replicated overnight. For Saudi Vision 2030 to succeed, it must take market share from the UAE. There's no way around it. The regional market for high-end tourism, business conferences, international investments, and expatriate talent is large, but not infinite. When a corporation decides to establish its Middle East headquarters, it's usually choosing between Riyadh, Dubai, and maybe Abu Dhabi. When wealthy tourists plan a Gulf vacation, they're comparing Saudi attractions to Emirati ones. When tech companies scout locations for regional data centers or innovation hubs, they're weighing the same set of cities. Every win for Saudi Arabia is often a loss for the UAE, and vice versa. This creates a zero-sum dynamic that plays out across multiple sectors. When Saudi Arabia launched NEOM, its futuristic megacity project on the Red Sea coast, it was competing directly with Dubai. NEOM promises flying cars, robot servants, an artificial moon, and a car-free linear city called The Line that will house 9 million people in a structure only 200 meters wide, but stretching over 100 miles. It's science fiction made policy. But it's also a direct challenge to Dubai's reputation as the region's most innovative, futuristic city. The billions being poured into NEOM are billions that might otherwise flow to Emirati real estate or development projects. When Riyadh invested billions in entertainment and tourism, opening cinemas after a decades-long ban, hosting international concerts, and building theme parks and resorts, it was trying to capture visitors who might otherwise go to Abu Dhabi or Dubai. Saudi Arabia started issuing tourist visas for the first time in 2019. It launched massive marketing campaigns showcasing its beaches, mountains, archaeological sites, and Red Sea diving spots. The message was clear. You don't need to go to the UAE anymore. We can offer you everything they can, plus the unique appeal of Islam's holiest sites and authentic Arabian culture. When Saudi Arabia positioned itself as a tech hub and AI center, investing billions in artificial intelligence research, cloud computing infrastructure, and venture capital for startups, it was challenging Emirati dominance in those sectors. Both kingdoms are racing to become the Middle East's Silicon Valley. They're bidding against each other for the same international conferences, the same corporate headquarters, the same foreign investors. The Web Summit, one of the world's largest tech conferences, moved from Lisbon to Rio and is now being courted by both Riyadh and Dubai. Formula One racing has events in both countries. Global music festivals are offered massive sums to choose one kingdom over the other. Every dollar that goes to Riyadh is a dollar that didn't go to Abu Dhabi, and vice versa. The UAE has advantages. It's more established, more trusted by international business, less burdened by conservative social restrictions that might deter Western executives or tourists. Dubai's reputation as a global city gives it cachet that Riyadh is struggling to match. Walk through Dubai International Airport and you hear dozens of languages. The city is a true melting pot where Emiratis are actually a minority in their own country. Expatriates make up over 80% of the UAE's population. This gives the Emirates a cosmopolitan feel that appeals to global capital. Businesses know the rules, they trust the legal system, they're comfortable with the culture of openness to foreigners, even if political freedoms are tightly controlled. But Saudi Arabia has scale that the UAE can never match. Its population is 3 times larger, around 35 million people compared to the UAE's 10 million. Its market is vastly bigger. A consumer brand that succeeds in Saudi Arabia reaches far more customers than one that only operates in the Emirates. Its oil reserves give it more financial firepower, even as both kingdoms try to reduce dependence on petroleum. Saudi Aramco, the state oil company, is the world's most valuable company. The Public Investment Fund, Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund, manages over $900 billion in assets and is on track to control over $2 trillion by 2030. And Saudi Arabia has something the UAE can never claim: the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, which give Riyadh unique religious and cultural authority across the Islamic world. Millions of Muslims from every corner of the globe make pilgrimages to Saudi Arabia every year for Hajj and Umrah. The king's official title, custodian of the 2 holy mosques, carries weight that no amount of economic development in Dubai can replicate. This religious legitimacy is both a source of power and a constraint. It gives Saudi Arabia moral authority to speak for Islamic causes, including Palestinian rights. But it also means the kingdom can't simply ignore religious sensibilities the way the more secular UAE can. This economic rivalry feeds the strategic competition in profound ways. When the UAE partners with Israel on technology and defense, it's not just about Iran or regional security. It's about access to Israeli innovation in cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, water technology, agricultural systems, and military hardware that can enhance Emirati competitiveness against Saudi Arabia. Israeli companies are helping the UAE develop its tech sector. Israeli defense contractors are upgrading Emirati military capabilities. Israeli intelligence services are sharing information that helps Abu Dhabi better understand regional threats and opportunities. This is a comprehensive partnership that makes the UAE more formidable across multiple dimensions. When Saudi Arabia refuses to normalize with Israel, it's not just about Palestine or domestic public opinion. It's about maintaining its position as the legitimate leader of the Arab and Islamic world, a position that would be severely undermined if Riyadh were seen as abandoning Palestinian rights for economic gain, the way the UAE has been portrayed. The kingdom has watched the UAE pay a reputational price in Arab public opinion. Opinion polls across the region consistently show majorities opposing the Abraham Accords. The UAE's embrace of Israel has damaged its standing in places like Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, and among Palestinians themselves. Saudi Arabia has taken note. If MBS normalizes under current conditions, he risks the same backlash but magnified by Saudi Arabia's unique role as guardian of Islam's holiest sites. The religious dimension deserves deeper examination because it's more than just symbolic. Saudi Arabia derives its fundamental legitimacy from custodianship of Islam's holiest sites. This isn't like being the headquarters of a corporation or the seat of a government. It's a sacred trust that stretches back centuries. The Al Saud family's compact with the Wahhabi religious establishment has defined Saudi identity since the kingdom's founding. Even MBS, for all his modernization efforts and crackdowns on conservative clerics, cannot simply ignore this foundation of legitimacy. The humanitarian implications deserve far more attention than they've received in Western media. Yemen has been devastated by years of war that started in 2015 and has become a multi-sided catastrophe. Over 400,000 people have died, most from indirect causes like disease and starvation rather than from combat. Millions face food insecurity in what the United Nations has repeatedly called one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. Infrastructure lies in ruins, hospitals lack basic supplies, schools have been destroyed. An entire generation of Yemeni children has grown up knowing nothing but war, displacement, hunger, and fear. The Saudi-UAE split has made peace harder to achieve, not easier. The Yemenis who need these two powers to cooperate on reconstruction and political settlement are instead watching them attack each other's proxies. The parties that need to sit at the same negotiating table to end the war are now bombing each other's weapons convoys and issuing ultimatums. The Houthis, who should be everyone's common enemy as an Iranian-backed militia that has fired missiles at Saudi cities and Emirati territory, are instead sitting back and watching their opponents self-destruct. This is a gift to the Houthis, strengthening their position and reducing pressure on them to compromise. The international community's attention has moved elsewhere. Yemen gets less coverage now than at any point since 2015. The UN Special Envoy works tirelessly, but with dwindling resources and waning great power interest. Humanitarian funding has dried up, aid organizations are pulling out, and the Saudi-UAE confrontation has shattered the Gulf coalition that was supposed to be leading Yemen towards stability. How can there be a peace process when the two countries that intervened together are now adversaries? In Sudan, the situation is even worse in terms of current humanitarian catastrophe. The civil war between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces has created what the UN calls the world's worst humanitarian crisis as of 2026. Over 10 million people have been displaced from their homes, forced to flee fighting that has turned residential neighborhoods into battlefields. Cities like Khartoum, once a vibrant capital, have been reduced to rubble as artillery pounds civilian areas. Atrocities are widespread, with reports of ethnic cleansing, sexual violence used as a weapon of war, and deliberate targeting of civilians. The International Criminal Court is investigating war crimes. Famine looms. Yet despite all this suffering, and despite international pressure, the UAE continues backing the RSF with weapons and logistical support. According to United Nations monitors and independent analysts who have tracked cargo flights and weapons shipments, the RSF controls gold mines and smuggling routes, and UAE support has enabled it to sustain its military campaign far longer than would otherwise be possible. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia backs the SAF, the official government army, and has tried to position itself as a force for mediation and stability. This isn't just prolonging the war, it's making it more lethal, more destructive, and harder to end through negotiation. When the two most powerful Gulf states are backing opposite sides, it makes any ceasefire or political settlement infinitely more complicated. Peace talks stall because neither armed faction feels pressure to compromise when they know their Gulf patron will continue support. Every day the fighting continues, more civilians die, more families are torn apart, more children grow up orphaned and traumatized, knowing only violence. The human cost of this proxy war is staggering, yet it barely registers in Gulf capitals focused on their own strategic competition. What about the Abrahamic Accords themselves? Are they doomed? Not necessarily, but their expansion is on life support. None of the signatory states have cut ties with Israel despite public opposition to the Gaza war. Trade continues. Embassies remain open, but momentum has stalled. Bahrain left its ambassador post in Israel vacant since April 2025. Morocco and Bahrain face domestic pressure. Sudan's agreement was never ratified and looks dead amid civil war and closer ties with Iran. The UAE president was the first Arab leader to call Netanyahu after October 7, 2023, signaling resilience in the relationship. But even Emirati officials acknowledge the accords have changed nature. They're no longer a peace project, one analyst noted. They've survived, but transformed into something more transactional, more fragile. Saudi normalization, once seen as inevitable, is drifting away. Trump's Gulf visit in October 2025 produced major U.S.-Saudi announcements on nuclear cooperation and F-35 sales, but no visible progress toward normalization. The guns in Gaza have largely fallen silent in recent months, yet talk of normalization has also gone quiet. The Palestinian issue, which Saudi Arabia insists must be resolved first, remains as intractable as ever. Netanyahu's government has made clear it will not accept a Palestinian state. Israel's far-right coalition partners view such a move as rewarding terrorism. The two-state solution, which Saudi Arabia demands as a prerequisite, has never seemed more distant. Looking ahead, several scenarios are possible, each with profound implications for the entire Middle East. The optimistic scenario is that both kingdoms recognize they're better off cooperating than confronting, and find a face-saving way to de-escalate before irreparable damage is done. Perhaps a third party, maybe Oman with its reputation for neutrality, or Kuwait with its historical mediation skills, steps in to mediate. Perhaps the Trump administration, which has invested so much political capital in relationships with both MBS and MBZ, applies enough pressure to force compromise. Perhaps economic interests, the billions at stake in trade and investment, overwhelm strategic rivalry as business leaders in both countries push for reconciliation. In this scenario, Saudi Arabia and the UAE agree to disagree on Israel while cooperating on other issues where interests align. They partition spheres of influence in places like Yemen and Sudan, drawing lines that both can live with. They maintain a cold peace that prevents open conflict, even if the warmth and trust are gone. They continue competing economically, but within bounds, avoiding actions that directly undermine each other. This would require both sides to swallow pride, accept limitations, and prioritize stability over victory. It's possible, but it would mark a fundamental change in how both kingdoms see their roles in the region. The pessimistic scenario is that tensions continue to escalate along the current trajectory. More proxy battles erupt as both sides test each other's resolve. Economic competition intensifies into economic warfare, with each trying to poach the other's investors and tourists through any means necessary. The information war gets uglier, with state-backed media in both countries spreading increasingly inflammatory rhetoric. Regional actors are forced to choose sides, unable to maintain neutrality as Saudi Arabia and the UAE both demand loyalty. Saudi Arabia builds its coalition with Egypt, the most populous Arab country, Turkey with its military power and Islamic credentials, Pakistan with its nuclear weapons, and others who oppose what they see as the UAE-Israel axis, threatening traditional Islamic and Arab solidarity. The UAE, for its part, deepens its partnership with Israel and attracts states that prioritize economic opportunity and technological advancement over political principle. Bahrain stays loyal to the Accords, despite domestic opposition. Morocco maintains its position. Some African states, attracted by UAE investment, tilt toward Abu Dhabi. The Middle East fractures into blocs that can't cooperate on anything from counterterrorism to economic integration to conflict resolution. Joint institutions like the Gulf Cooperation Council become hollow shells. In this scenario, the regional order that's existed since the early 2000s, built on Gulf unity and increasing integration, collapses entirely and is replaced by a new Cold War between Sunni Arab powers. The most likely scenario is somewhere in between these extremes. Muddle through, as analysts say. The rivalry continues, but with guardrails preventing the worst outcomes. Neither side wants full rupture because the costs would be catastrophically high. So they compete intensely while avoiding direct military confrontation. They undermine each other in proxy theaters while maintaining diplomatic channels for crisis management. They cooperate on issues where interests align, like countering Iran or managing oil markets, while battling over everything else. This scenario produces chronic instability, but not catastrophic collapse. It's not peace, but it's not war either. It's a new normal for the Gulf. History will record that in late 2025 and early 2026, the Middle East reached a turning point that few in the West fully recognized. Not because of a war between states, not because of a revolution, but because two countries that should have been partners chose divergent paths, and the gap between them became unbridgeable. The promise that the Abrahamic Accords held, of a new Middle East integrated through commerce and cooperation, has given way to a different reality. The Accord succeeded in normalizing UAE-Israel ties, but failed to create broader regional transformation. Instead, they exposed and accelerated a rift between Gulf powers whose alignment was essential to stability. The Abrahamic divide is real, it's deepening, and the consequences will shape the region for decades to come. The promise of peace through the Abraham Accords has given way to the reality of division. And in the Middle East, division has always come at the highest price, paid by those with the least power to resist it. The civilians in Yemen, Sudan, and Somalia, who will bear the brunt of this rivalry, had no say in the decisions that created it. The Palestinian families, whose hopes for statehood have been used as a political football between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, deserve better. The millions of people across the region who simply want stability, prosperity, and peace are watching their futures determined by a power struggle between princes. This is the paradox of the Abraham Accords that historians will study and debate for decades to come. They were supposed to bring peace to the region, but have contributed to division. They were supposed to integrate the broader region, but have helped fracture it. They were supposed to marginalize regional extremists, but maybe creating space for them to exploit. The architects of the Accords, brilliant diplomats and deal-makers who worked for years to bring them to fruition, didn't anticipate this outcome. They believed that normalizing relations between Israel and Arab states would create unstoppable momentum for broader peace. They thought economic ties, billions of dollars in trade and investment, would override political differences and historical grievances. They assumed that UAE's example, a wealthy and successful Arab state openly partnering with Israel, would be followed by others eager for the same prosperity and security. None of that has happened in the way they expected. Instead of expansion, the Accords have stalled. Instead of momentum, there's paralysis. Instead of bringing Saudi Arabia into the fold, which was always the ultimate prize, the Accords have pushed Riyadh in the opposite direction. The kingdom has not only refused to normalize, but has positioned itself as the defender of Palestinian rights and Arab dignity against what it sees as premature and unprincipled normalization. The divide between those who signed the Accords and those who didn't has hardened into something more dangerous, a fundamental split about the future of the Arab world. The Middle East in 2026 is being reshaped not by grand visions or historic breakthroughs, but by the unintended consequences of decisions made in 2020. The Abraham Accords succeeded brilliantly in their narrow goal of establishing formal Israeli-Emirati relations. The bilateral relationship is genuine, deep, and likely durable regardless of what happens elsewhere. But the Accords failed catastrophically to account for how that success would affect broader regional dynamics, particularly the relationship between the Arab world's two most powerful states. That failure, that blind spot in the strategic vision, is now playing out across multiple battlegrounds. And the costs, measured in lives lost in Yemen and Sudan, in opportunities forgone for peace and development, in deepening divisions that will take generations to heal, are mounting with each passing day.